now on with the conference itself. We have a very interesting keynote coming up. So this weekend I was finally starting to think about the conference because it was about time that I did. And I said, OK, so what's the keynote on the first day? Well, it's something about identity. So the first thought in my mind was there are sponsors. There are big sponsors for conferences like this because it's really difficult to put them on, especially in venues like this. Without sponsors, you actually need money for the infrastructure to do this stuff for you. So I thought, well, it's obviously a talk on authentication by one of the big companies that put forward sponsorship money. And then I read the description of the talk. It is not that at all. This is a talk on identity that is not what you would expect when people use that term at technology conferences. So I want you to please welcome to the stage Janelle Klein, who is going to tell you about a completely different aspect of identity.
That was sure insightful, huh? Loved that. What is identity? So this talk was inspired by a conversation I had last November with one of the most incredible people I've ever met in my life, Jason Huggins. And we were at dinner in London, which was awesome in itself. And I've just never seen someone get so fired up and excited about robots. And when he talked about his dreams of these collaborative robotic art projects and how we can take all this collaborative software stuff and bring it into the 3D space and do these amazing projects together, it was like the coolest thing ever. And he just lit up like a little kid at Christmas. It was beautiful. And then he said something that I haven't stopped thinking about since. But art has no utility. And I watched his heart kind of sink as he started talking about all these rational things he was going to do to make money other than the thing that was obviously in his heart to do. And I spent the rest of the evening arguing with him about why he needed to pursue his dreams. And then the next morning, he sent me a text, and he was like, I forgot to ask, why purple? Which is obviously a commentary on my identity, right? And I was still upset about the night before, so I was thinking about, how do I answer this question in a way that shows why I'm right and he's wrong? And so I started working on this effort of purple as code. You know, here's me and my identity and my little sparkly self in the middle. And when my consciousness asks me, what should I do? And I have all these emotions that shine out of me, my dreams and my fears, I pick the purple one. And identity is the operating system of the self. And as I started working on this identity material, it started kind of colliding in metaphors with all this research I've been doing on idea flow and pain and development. And as I put all these models together, I ended up with an explicit theory of consciousness, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So this is the dreamer operating system. And identity you can think of as the memory model in the middle. And you've got ideas flowing into your brain, and a vector with dreams that you're trying to achieve, a pain signal, an awesome signal, and a feedback loop for making better decisions. And our goal in one case is to move toward dreams, or we've got this other variation where we've got kind of this cheat loop when we move away from nightmares, but there's not really a whole lot of movement going on. We more so just create a little bubble world in our mind. So a lot of this material comes from personal experience that so I'm going to share my story with you on where I came up with a lot of these ideas. So when I was growing up, my mom always told me to find your passion and follow it wherever it leads, and don't let anyone ever take that away from you. And so when I grew up, I was really into music, played guitar and sang and wrote music for my high school choir and orchestra. And so when I went to college, I went to school to be a songwriter. That was my dream. And then when I got in school, though, I kind of got a reality check of what a career in music would actually be like. And I was like, I don't know if I want to do this. And I was kind of feeling a little lost. And my boyfriend at the time, trying to cheer me up, he's like, let's take a class together. That'd be fun. And he starts looking through the catalog, and he's like, ooh, x86 assembly. Let's do that one. Now, you got to keep in mind that my only experience with computers at this point was playing King's Quest, okay? So here I am in this assembly programming class, and I was, flipping through the book and realizing, oh, this is kind of like programming my TI-85 in math class. I've got some basic instructions. I can do this. And that weekend, I read through the entire assembly book, and then I found interrupts. And I realized I could change the screen to graphics mode, and I could make the PC speaker beep. And I started making the game Breakout completely in assembly with little colored blocks, a little ball that bounced around and made the PC speaker beep. And I showed my teacher what I was working on. And he's like, why don't you just show me what you're doing, and you get an A. I'm like, I like this class. This is awesome. And that's when it hit me. I had to work on something, but I could work on anything I wanted to. I could create anything that I could dream. I mean, how amazing is that we can take our ideas and bring them to life in our tools. And a friend of mine, I think, said this perfectly, of software development is the closest thing in this world to magic. And if you think about it, it's true. We are the magicians of the world. So I was really fired up about all this software stuff, but then my life took a bit of a turn, and I kind of went into this downward spiral. And at 18, I decided to get married. Not the smartest thing to do when you're 18. And my husband was an abused child, and he was deeply afraid all the time that somebody was going to find out about this crazy world that we lived in. And so he started isolating me from everyone I loved. And I just got sucked into this crazy world of lies and shame. And it was a really dark time in my life. And then one day he said, if you go to school, I will leave you. And here I was, in this dream world, almost gone, just, on the edge, and wondering what I'm going to do, just feeling miserable with all this fear and depression and not knowing what to do. And in that moment, I kind of screamed inward at myself, who am I? And I heard this voice inside me that said, I am an engineer. And I felt this love in my heart for all these things that I wanted to do in my life, for software and my dreams and all these things that I wanted to create. And there was no other option but to choose the thing that I loved. And so I turned to my husband and said, I'm going to school. And screw you for trying to stand in my way. And in that moment, all this baggage that I've been holding on for years just kind of melted away, and I made a commitment in my life to always live my dreams. And so, this is one of those experiences that fundamentally changes your life. This was 15 years ago, but I very much still live by this today. So, what I want to focus on, though, is how our crazy brains actually work that makes all this stuff happen, because it's something that we all need to understand because we are people. And we have to work and have intimate relationships with other people in our jobs. So, dreamer operating system. How do ideas get inside of our head? So this is kind of the sensory input system. And we're going to talk about the sensory to semantic, kind of a map-reduce function you can imagine it as. So this is a synthesis based on the research in On Intelligence by Jeff Hawkins and Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. So think of a concept as a metaphorical shape. So imagine that your brain is a shape toy with a face. And when you look out into the world, you see all these different shapes, right? And when you're looking at these shapes, you ask, do I know this pattern? And if you recognize the pattern, you take the shape and kind of shove it into your shape toy brain. But if all the things you see out there you don't recognize, you don't see anything. No shape basically equals no recognition. So for example, let's say a friend asks us, what is closure? And you've got this concept of closure in your head that you're trying to communicate to your friend. So you take this message and put it on the wire to communicate it over to your friend, but your friend only hears gibberish. So the way this works, recognition is a bottom-up process. You imagine you've got these sensory signals on the bottom layers of your brain, and you summarize, 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 and get this concept of closure. But same thing happens with recognition failure, summarize, 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 but because we don't get into any resolution, you get confusion. So because of how our brain works this way, new shapes are always defined relative to old shapes. So if you want to explain closure to your friend, and your friend understands Lisp, which is a functional language, and understands Groovy, which is a JVM language, you can kind of put those two concepts together and go, okay, I've got a new foundational idea of what closure is now. So the key thing to remember here is kind of this derived knowledge principle, is that everything we understand is in terms of other things we already understand, with the exception of that sensory to semantic MapReduce. Everything else is additive. Everything is a metaphor. All right, moving on. How do ideas turn us into who we are? So this is the outer layer of our identity, or what I think of as tribal identity. So we've got three different types of concepts. We've got thing patterns, relationship patterns, and process patterns. And you can think of these as different shapes that you shove into your shape toy brain. And base classes for thing patterns, we've got a physical object, and I, a personal reference to ourself. Base classes for relationship patterns, we have containers, so like in-group and out-group. And you put things and containers together, and you get a foundational model for identity. So here we have a human identity and an object identity. And the fundamental difference between a human identity and object identity has nothing to do with whether it's actually a human or an object. So for example, class cat extends I, and class chicken extends object. And in one case, we have empathy, and in the other case, we short-circuit empathy. And this is why we can eat a chicken, but not a cat. And then direction metaphors give us things like rank. So we can rank people, we can rank objects, and we can rank categories. And humans love to rank things. We've got the 30 healthiest foods of all time, top 10 restaurants, or who has the highest DPS in Warcraft. So the important thing to remember here is our brain is a sense-making engine. We can't turn this off. Like all these different ideas that come into our mind, we're categorizing all these things in terms of shapes and directions and containers, and that's how we make sense of it in our brain. And this has some really fascinating effects when we start looking at human behavior patterns. So collectivism, which you hear a lot more about these days, is basically thinking in categories. So when we've got two things in the in-group, we look for similarities between those things. And we've got something in the in-group and in the out-group, we look for differences. And this has some really interesting effects. So for example, we're pre-wired to model the in-group with this similarity-seeking behavior. So in this case, you extends from I. If you're like me, then I belong in your group. And so for example, here's my team. And on my team, we write unit tests, and we pair program. And I ask you, do you do these things? And what do you say? Yes, right? We know what the right answer is. It's just wired into our brain that if we want to be part of that group, that we do the things like the group does. We model that behavior. And the flip side also happens. So we're pre-wired to objectify the out-group with difference seeking, pushing them away, far away from ourselves as we can. So in this case, you extends from object. You're nothing like me. So for example, developers and testers. Testers extend from object. Testers are a tool for us to use. And often we've got this superiority complex of thinking we're better than testers too, right? Or another example, smart people, idiots. Idiots extend from object. Idiots are a tool for us to use, right? Or how about managers and employees? Employees extend from object. Employees are a tool for us to use. You know, same principle here, but now we're on the other side of the wall, and it's not quite so funny anymore, because nobody likes to be treated like an object. So the point I'm trying to make here is that whenever I decide someone is not like me, I short-circuit empathy. And this is why we act like assholes. So, brain hack number one, how do you stop being an asshole? And the trick here, you rewire your brain for empathy. So here, for example, I met with this person, and I have all these feelings of disgust. Maybe they're a tester, and they support a political candidate I don't like. So here's how you rewire your brain. You ready? This is the answer for world peace. Step 1, stop and think. Is this a person or an object? Step 2, choose person. And what happens here, we shift into this similarity-seeking mode, and these feelings of disgust sort of transform into feelings of pity, which is not necessarily great, but it's a better place to start a relationship, right? So we're also pre-wired to extend identity to offspring. So this is me, this is my baby. My baby always extends I. My baby is a part of me. And we're also pre-wired to extend identity to SoulCrafts. This is me, this is my code. My code also extends from I. And so we run into a problem here, because if somebody tells us our code sucks, it hurts, right? So, brain hack number 2, how do you stop feeling defensive? You can use the same kind of trick and rewire your brain to disable empathy. So here I am, and somebody just told me my code sucks, and here's what I'm going to do. Step 1, stop and think. Is my code a person or an object? Step 2, choose object. And just sitting there going, I am not my code, I am not my code, over and over again, you can start to disable that feeling of empathy for your code and start shutting down those feelings. But the problem is unlike the other example, we can only kind of temporarily sort of fool ourselves with this trick, and those feelings keep coming back, and that this is basically a lie that we tell ourselves. I don't actually love my baby. It's not really true, but you kind of turn your feelings off temporarily so you can have an objective discussion about your code. But this is something we're just wired to love on our code, and that's just something that we should think of more of a design constraint. All right, let's get into feelings. Where does gut feel come from? And this is where we get into the feeling machine. So the way I think of this is you can take your orbital frontal cortex and limbic system and think of it like a summarized body response, where you get this pain signal or an awesome signal or all these various colors of it. All right, so we don't normally think of feelings as coming from the body, but it's basically how it works. So if I ask a simple question, do I want fruit or salad? And I got to make a decision. So what do? I think fruit and simulate the body experience, and then I get the signal back of, not so much, not feeling like fruit today. Same thing, think salad, simulate the body experience, fairly awesome, feeling like some green things today. And this basic mechanic we use for making decisions all the time for these gut feel instincts. And we do the same thing when we encounter people. Do I like Sally? Think about Sally, simulate the body experience. Like Sally a lot, apparently. Do I like George? Same thing, simulate the body experience. Not feeling so much. And this is why you get feelings like disgust, which is associated with rotten food, associated with people, as these are actually feelings that are coming from our body. Now with more complex decisions, it works a little bit different. So if I imagine in the moment I'm making a decision, I can think of my decision like a function. I've got some inputs to my decision, I've got some logical evaluation and an output. And in those moments I'm making that decision, I can imagine all these different feelings of these that go with these different options. So like, for example, should I write a test? Maybe, sounds like a good idea. Skip the test? Probably not. Delete all the code, that always sounds like a good plan, right? But where do these feelings actually come from? And this is where we get into the base classes for process patterns. So you can think about this journey as having a beginning and an end, and we're hopping over obstacles, and we've got this roller coaster of human experience that we're expressing through these stories. So, for example, what are the challenges on the journey? And I can imagine constraints or walls that I run into. I might have feelings of frustration. Or I can imagine friction, like mud I have to trudge through, that might have feelings of pain. Or I can have strategy, this path that I go around the mud, and have feelings of victory. And so you can think about the journey as being constructed of these chainable parts of situation, strategy, and consequence. So for example, let's say I brought down production after this unfortunate chain of events. This sucks, right? That's no fun. So how do I avoid the pain next time? So what do? Well, we start doing what-if analysis. And thinking about alternative paths that we could have run, right? What if I had reviewed the configs? What if I had written better tests? And you start thinking about all the things that you could have done instead, and then when you're happy in that hypothetical world of the things that you could have done differently, you're like, all right, I'll do better next time because I've got all these hypothetical alternatives. But how do we actually do better next time? And basically what happens, these alternative hypothetical scenarios get wired together into this prediction machine. So you can think about, if I see this situation that is similar to the one in the past, it's going to recall the sense of all this pain that I happened from my past experiences. And through this simple heuristic of minimize pain and maximize awesome, I have intuition about a strategy that ends up coming to mind. And the gut feel basically arises through this basic mechanic of pattern reinforcement. All right, and then this is where things start getting interesting. What is cognitive dissonance? So this is this moment we get a pattern that comes in that we don't recognize, and we're like, what should I do? And we get into this learning loop behavior where we have to make adjustments. So this is based on the research of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So our brain you can think of as constantly making predictions. So I've got all these patterns that I've recognized in the recent past, and then in any given moment, I make a prediction about what I expect to see next. And the key here to remember is that we only update our brain code when predictions fail. So for example, imagine you're walking down the stairs and you're just thinking about something else, everything's just fine. At this point, all your predictions are confirmed, right? You're just going through that loop. And then suddenly, one of the steps isn't quite where it's supposed to be. And in this moment, your predictions are violated. And what happens in our brain is this runtime exception effect, where we're like, WTF, that wasn't supposed to happen, which alerts our consciousness to come in and do some analysis on the scenario and figure out what to do. And I say this as this WTF event because it's the same thing that happens when we code. When we run into something unexpected, the same pattern fires in our brain. And what happens is we go into this troubleshooting process where our consciousness gets alerted and asks, what should I do? That fires up all this extra machinery where we're going to search all these long-distance neural connections where you can think of indexes into all those metaphors. And then we analyze, what do I see? Why is it happening? And how did I solve these problems in the past? And then when we integrate this historical information into the current context, we get insight, or what we think of as know-how of some strategy that we're going to apply. And then we apply motor energy to doing these things. And then at the end, there's this ding of dopamine, which says, basically, we're done. And at that point, we've got these two conflicting models from the dissonance that sort of collapse into one. And we have this experience of synchronicity, which is associated with relief. And then the dopamine signal basically means, remember this, which is basically our brain's automation mechanism. So back with what we had before, we had this recognition bottom-up process. And then something wasn't recognized. We get this alert process where we have to troubleshoot the problem. And that brings up that cognitive dissonance in our mind. And then when we respond to the particular solution, to the problem, and then we get that ding of dopamine, what happens is all those active networks that were lit up in our brain in that moment get wired together. And this is how we end up with autopilot mode, or continuous decision automation, you can think of. All of that gets baked into our subconscious. So you can think of consciousness as this kind of on-demand service. So we've got this automated thinking that has all these feelings that come out of our brain. And then we've got this signaling mechanism that triggers effortful thinking, this kind of summon-on-demand system that is really, really expensive. And so we only want to use that when we absolutely have to, try and run on low brain power. So what happens if you have lots of demand for effortful thinking, you have this happen, right? This is a common problem we have in the software development world. We need lots of sugar to sustain all that troubleshooting we have to do all day. All right, so what is self-deception, this cheat loop in this dream world where we're trying to move away from nightmares, yet don't do so very successfully? So this is a synthesis of the research in leadership and self-deception. and rewire your brain. And I love that these books like don't go together at all. It's like psychology and brains, and you just merge them and cool stuff comes out. So social rejection is also a violated prediction. So you can think of my identity predicted I should be included in this group, and the group said no, WTF, that wasn't supposed to happen, right? So the same response of our brain happens. We have this pain associated with this experience, and then our consciousness comes in to troubleshoot identity, because clearly our identity is broken. So how do we troubleshoot identity? Well, here's me, and here's this group that I was expecting to be a part of that said no, that I couldn't be part of the group. And so the first thing I'm going to do is think of all the reasons why I didn't actually want to be in that group, and think about all these differences and how I didn't want to do that, and turn that in-group into an out-group, and map these feelings of pain to feelings of disgust. But usually, in order to do that, I also got to come up with a pack of lies to tell myself. So then our friend comes along and is like, dude, what are you talking about? Well, how do we fix this? Because it's bringing up all these painful memories now that we had in the past. Well, maybe our friend isn't actually our friend, and they were just not being very nice, and we think about all the things that they did in the past and why they're not our friend, so we can turn them into an out-group and shut those feelings off. So self-deception, you can kind of thinking as a coping mechanism that stops the pain immediately. And so we can rely on these easy solutions to solve these problems of experiencing pain. So what happens when we try to be what everyone else wants us to be? Because being rejected is no fun. And so one of the alternatives to that is to move towards this acceptance-seeking behavior, which is largely driven by fear, because who wants to be rejected? And so what happens is this fragmentation effect, which is kind of the other side. So here we are in this moment of dissonance, and we're trying to resolve, what should I do? And you can think of, we've got our authentic choice, or our heart's desire, what we actually want to do. And then we've got these feelings of fear that are driving us into a different direction. And as we deviate from our authentic choice, we have to rationalize the reasoning for our decision, come up with all these reasons for stuff, and we create this kind of memory barrier so we can block off the stuff that doesn't actually make sense. And this is how we end up creating this dream world so that we can feel better about it. But the problem is this memory barrier kind of deteriorates over time. And now we've got this cognitive dissonance that's internal from this self-deception, and then our sensory memory kind of on the inside. And all this anxiety comes up from this internal dissonance. So how do we solve that? Well, this is where dopamine comes in. We find some way to distract ourselves, which kind of works like a drug. And what it does is it reinforces those walls to make those feelings go away. And then we end up with a reinforced dream world. So the problem with this pattern is all that sensory memory is also associated with our internal self. And so as we keep doing this distraction mechanism over and over with dopamine, we end up falling into this state of deep loneliness where we end up getting depressed because we essentially cut ourselves off from the world. So, brain hack number 3, how do we escape? This is where we get into Identity 2.0. So I mentioned this experience that I had 15 years ago, and I went through a major transformation at this point, and what I realized as I was thinking about this is I am the guardian of my light. I am responsible for protecting and defending that little sparkle inside myself. If I let that little sparkle get snuffed out, there's not too much to go from there. So you can think of Identity 1.0 as I am the sum of my past, or the data is me. Versus Identity 2.0, I am the one who chooses in the moment, or consciousness is me. So the way I think of consciousness is as a pressure system that's always moving from the state of dissonance to the state of synchronicity. And it always goes in that direction. There's no option there. That energy will move. And the only real option or question is what type of energy is going to drive us to some kind of closure. And so if I think about consciousness as the director of focus, basically I've got 2 neural networks that I could potentially light up. And this is me, the one who's making this choice of which direction am I going to go. The only other option we have here is self-awareness, which is kind of focusing on yourself. And you can think of this as sort of leveling up your crystal and getting XP that gives you more increased executive function to be able to make these kind of decisions. So the way I started thinking about my identity is myself being this crystal. So you can think of your eternal self. And the way I wanted to kind of try and define a concept that I could wrap myself around as this identity, I started asking, what are the choices I can make every day that define who I am as a person? What are the choices I can make every day that define who I am as a person? And what I came up with is 5 core principles that I call the C.L.E.A.R mindset: courage, leadership, empathy, authenticity, and respect. So the way I think of this is Identity 2.0 is a principle of continuous choice. So courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to do it anyway, despite fear. Leadership is the decision to carry the torch, to commit to the journey, however long the journey takes. Empathy is the decision to be patient in understanding each other and patient in understanding ourselves. Authenticity isn't the lack of a filter, like a lot of people seem to think. Authenticity is the lack of self-deception. It's the decision to seek truth. And respect is the decision to see other people as humans with thoughts and feelings similar to our own rather than objects to manipulate for our own gain, essentially the no asshole rule. And so the way I started thinking about shining my light is this is me, and I've got my past lessons learned, and once these patterns are baked into my brain, they basically become part of your body. You can kind of think of it as a database. And then here's my vector of dreams that I'm on that I'm trying to achieve. And here's me getting XP and leveling up my crystal, and I'm kind of riding on the front of the boat, choosing in the moment. And what I've learned is that essentially momentum on this journey ends up resulting in joy in the moment. And so because of that, my first principle in life became optimizing for joy and to treat purple, whether it's my purple or someone else's purple, as a design constraint. The problem is, this is actually pretty tough to do in practice. You know, it's easy to say, simple principle, but really hard to live by. And so what I started doing was wearing purple on the outside as a way to remind myself on the inside of who I am and what I stand for and what I believe in. So in those times when I get scared and go crawl back inside my shell, when I come out again, I can be like, okay, this is the decision that I need to make, and I need to live by my authentic self. And the reason I was so upset with Jason is that when you find your passion, you know, that thing that just makes you light up like a happy little kid, it's beautiful. And once you find that, you know, it's not only about you anymore. You bring that joy to everyone around you, every life you touch. And if you give up your dreams, it's not only you losing out. Everyone else that would benefit from your awesomeness ends up missing out too. I was thinking about this comment about, you know, art having no utility, and art actually has one of the greatest utilities in the world. So let's talk about the utility of art. So here I'm in this state of deep loneliness and having lots of challenges in life, and one of the things you find about joy is it's the one thing that's able to penetrate through all this and make us feel that radiance on the inside, such when we glow, it breaks down these walls, and then as opposed to deep loneliness, we start feeling this sense of human connection. And that's the awesome thing about joy. And what greater utility is there than healing people's hearts, you know? But the problem is, we define our definitions of utility based around money in this business machine, right? And the business machine and our concepts about money are totally out of alignment with what actually feeds our souls as human beings. In the business machine, people are objects. Whereas the reality is, we're more like a family. Now, you're never going to think about your coworkers the same way again after this, huh? And so what happens, we have this massively dysfunctional relationship in our organizations that kind of looks like this, where on one side it's all about pain, and on the other side it's all about money. And we drive our projects into the ground over and over again. It's this heartbreaking experience. And if you zoom out a little bit, we see the same patterns, at larger and larger scales, where on one case it's all about money, and on the other case it's all about pain, and we just can't seem to talk to each other. So what if we started optimizing all these organizational structures around this principle, treating purple as a design constraint, letting the people do what is in their hearts to do, and then we built our organizations around that? What would happen if we built a purple world? I think free education and no more taxes. That would be better, right? So I'm someone who is actually crazy enough of a dreamer to think I have a chance in hell at pulling something like this off. So a few years ago, I started working on open mastery, which has kind of a double meaning here. So mastery being the continuous pursuit of awesome, and open referring to learning out loud. So we're an engineering guild that's working on learning how to learn together and helping each other to be more awesome as a community. But we've also got this double meaning of engineering a purple world. And we're working on a strategy to make mastery level education free to every human in the world. So there's two major challenges with this. One, it's going to cost like $1 bazillion, right? The other major challenge is it's going to take unprecedented levels of cooperation. But how can we actually pull something like this off? So here's sort of the master plan, 5 steps, right? We're going to make mastery level education free to every human in the world. All right, so we start small and iterate. This is kind of how we do things, right? So step 1, measure your pain. So these are tools that we're working on right now and based on kind of the idea flow stuff. So you can imagine these are, plug into your IDE and you're in the moment working on some code, you get an unexpected crazy error message on your screen, and you're looking at the code going, WTF, what does this do? So you highlight the code that's giving you a problem, annotate it with your question, and then basically what we're doing is pulling background data of context of what's going on when you're working, and with all these overlays of information you're adding to the system. And we're building kind of a visual profiler of these things. So in this case, 5 hours and 18 minutes of troubleshooting this painful configuration error, it gives us a universal definition as a team of what pain is. So tools here, these are open source, so should be out really soon. I've learned my lessons that deadlines and open source projects don't really go together very well. So if you're interested in helping out with this effort, I would appreciate it too. Looking for some Angular 2 help right now. And then, next step here, transforming your pain into an automated FAQ. So we're basically doing statistical process control on this developer experience data. So when you get something that's out of bounds, say a troubleshooting incident that took longer than 20 minutes, you annotate with your pain type, add commentary to things, and this becomes basically an automated FAQ. And so in this case, you can imagine all the things that you might set up various thresholds and rules for, and then annotating and talking about those incidents as a team. And so we're targeting this for June 15th of this year, kind of team level FAQ platform, and this will be more like Jira pricing. And then this is where things get interesting. So we're translating all the metrics into a semantic graph. So we've got all these feelings over time, and you can imagine this as the periods that you're spending in cognitive dissonance. And the big ones here, we're going to label with those pain tags. And then you've got context tags in terms of the tasks and subtasks on things that you might tag in different ways. And then the context tags get pushed down. The pane tags kind of bubble up to the top like a profiler. And then we can basically put together story points with, you've got an object URI, the tags on it, and those are attached to the metrics and all the data that happened for those incidents. And what we're doing with that is building an automated insight platform. So I've got this story point feed coming in real time, and then I've got this cognitive dissonance incident. Now Dreamer OS is wondering, OK, how can I help? The developer's having some trouble here. And so we can search for insight based in the story web FAQ that we've got from past experiences and look for what patterns do I see, why is this happening, how did I solve similar problems in the past? And then once we integrate here, we can ask you questions or insights. So remember that time you worked on the reporting engine and spent 5 hours debugging that configuration error? What if there's a configuration error here? And give you some questions that can help guide your troubleshooting based on the patterns in your current experience, plus what you've ran into historically in the past. And then once you solve that problem and mark it as yay, this becomes our dopamine signal that ties us to automate this cause and effect pattern. And what we're going to do with this is wire this up to one of Jason's cute little robots, which will amuse me to have on my desk. I don't know if it will you, but he does dance the robot right now, but we're gonna make him even cooler with all kinds of fun machine learning stuff. Anyway, so we're gonna rig him up with a mic and speaker so he can kind of ask you questions and act as your pair programming buddy. And then as you train him up with more and more data, he gets XP, and you get to level up his little crystal. And as he gets better and better at asking questions, he'll start to act more and more like a little human. So we're working on the Dev Insight platform for June 15th, 2018. All right. So basically, the best way I can think of to describe Dreamer OS is as an automated Socratic inquiry system. So you can think about, we're asking, what question should I ask next? And applying the same old machine learning type of logic, but just with really strongly structured data, so we can simulate that type of gut feel system to create a really good question asking solution. All right. So next challenge is building a purple organization. So at that point, y'all are going to have to read this book. I think this is probably the best sort of rough design template of where we ought to be headed with respect to trying to design our organizations around people's natural abilities, gifts, and learning how to learn together as a group. And one of the key paradigm shifts in the book is moving from machine, thinking about the organization as a machine, to an organism, or I like to think of as a business creature who's purple. And so you can imagine my business creature has these past lessons of the past that kind of works like a database or a body of all these lessons learned. And then we've got dreams that we're trying to achieve. And then we've got a pain signal that's going to be wired up to all the pain signals within the organization, and an awesome signal that you can wire up to, say, customer metrics. And then we've got an innovation loop on figuring out how to do better and operate our business creature more effectively. And then money becomes like the food we eat in order to survive. So we have to eat to live, but our purpose in life is not to eat. We need to have some kind of bigger purpose of what we're trying to achieve as a group of humans. And so this basically becomes our cash cow for doing all of our educational efforts. And then we start working on re-engineering the game of life. So it's an MMORPG with a gamified education platform. So once we've got this massive industry knowledge base and our little robots become smart enough to mentor people, we're basically going to retool our entire core platform into this really awesome game. And since one of the best ways to learn how to develop software is to develop software, we're basically going to turn the development of the educational modules into the game itself. And so we'll set up purple monster guilds that work on educational modules for adding things to the software. where guilds then can invite folks to their guild and work on these things. And then we'll give awards away for all the awesomest, most creative purple contributions and stuff we see. And if you want to know about somebody else's purple contributions, kind of integrate this Pokemon Go style, right? And so you can imagine, other things you might do. You see somebody on your team that made some really creative idea or mentored somebody or whatever kind of purple contributions you see in the world. We can basically build this culture of honoring each other and honoring all these awesome things that we're doing, both locally, and then we can, do award things and stuff like that as well. So building out this educational game will basically be about incorporating all these people into these fun projects in our team and then mentoring people in the context of an actual development project to totally change the way that we do education and crowdsource peer mentorship across the industry. And so we're planning on having our first mentor bots out at November 8th, 2020, and hopefully create, some hope for the world to go with the event of the next election. So, I've committed my life to leading this effort, and all my IP, I'm basically doing this all for public benefit. And I'm really concerned about the direction right now that we're going as a country and a world. But the thing that I've realized is that, if we want a plan B, we're going to have to build a plan B. And if you think about our industry, we are the engineers of the most powerful industry on our planet. I mean, we write the software that runs the world. And with the next major technological revolution, we're going to have the power to build the future that we want. The power to re-engineer our entire world is going to be in our hands. And so the question is, what are we going to do with that? We've got an opportunity to kind of come together and define the next generation of the world that we're going to live in. So this is a pivot, I think, on the way we need to start thinking about this with respect to taking ownership. That we take ownership of designing the game. And we make up the rules. And then we invite the world to play. So I'm Janelle Klein, founder of Open Mastery. And if you want to join me in standing up for purple, you can sign up for our tools beta here at tools.openmastery.org. I'll send you a free copy of my book, too. But remember, now is the time to start living your dreams. Thank you.
Thanks, Janelle. Did you hear the part where she mentioned business and then she talked about technology the entire time? Awesome talk. That was way more interesting than any authentication talk I've ever been to. I'm going to do this really quick. We have the next talk at 10:30. Tons of talks. There's EE. There's some Kotlin and Scala stuff. There's RX Java. So tons of stuff to learn. Couple of points. Please visit the exhibit floor. Lots of stuff to see out there. And also, please do rate the sessions. It is very helpful to the organization to understand how well the content is being received for future conferences to make it better and better. So thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference and get to that next talk.